I want us to become brothers again like we used to be, and for us to find ourselves and bond with each other. Can we agree to that?
Opinions vary.
Welcome to Three Brothers Filmcast, monthly roundtable podcast where the three brothers behind Three Brothers Film chat about a chosen movie or topic, as well as broader items of interest in film culture. I'm Aren Bergstrom, here with my brothers,
Anton.
And Aren.
And my last name is the same as my brother's.
And this month we're chatting about the new multi-part documentary film by Adam Curtis, Can't Get You Out of My Head, an emotional history of the modern world, which debuted on the BBC's iPlayer earlier this month. In a world that seems increasingly chaotic and out of control, Adam Curtis's films have gained a cult following by delving into the fascinating and sometimes little-known stories that have shaped and continue to drive our world. As fans of his past works, including his previous film, 2016's Hypernormalization, we thought we'd share our excitement over his return to filmmaking and delve into both his filmmaking style and some of the overarching narratives Curtis is exploring through it. We'll also pay tribute to Canadian acting icon Christopher Plummer later this episode, who passed away February 5th at the age of 91. We'll offer a few thoughts about his place in cinema history and mention some of our favorite roles of his. As always, we invite you to subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and if you like what we're doing, please rate and review. Reviews help others discover the podcast, and we welcome your feedback and support. And of course, liking Three Brothers Film on Facebook and sharing the podcast is a great way to show your support for what we're doing here. We have some great content coming out later this month to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Three Brothers Film, and we hope you'll stay tuned and celebrate with us. Now, on to this month's roundtable. I can't get you out of my head.
Okay, Ramblers, let's get rambling.
We are living through strange days. Across Britain, Europe and America, societies have become split and polarised, not just in politics, but across the whole culture. There is anger at the inequality and the ever-growing corruption, and a widespread distrust of the elites. Yet at the same time, there is a paralysis, a sense that no one knows how to escape from this. Even in America, where there is now hope with the new president, there are also fears that despite the growing crisis, the system will just return to normal. This paralysis is also fueled by a technology driven by the aim of giving you today another version of what you had yesterday, and never a different tomorrow.
Few filmmakers who aren't household names can claim such a distinct and consistent filmic vision across 30 years of filmmaking as Adam Curtis. With stories about the strange things that happen in the making of our modern world and the people who contributed to it, Adam Curtis's documentary films are an attempt to describe and give narrative shape to our world and how we got here. Working entirely with archival footage and narrated by Curtis himself in his soothing English accent, his films combine news and historical footage, clips from old movies, music videos, and other random footage edited together in an associative collage with some truly wonderful deep-cut needle drops. It's an ambitious project, made possible to a large degree by Curtis's position at the BBC and his nearly unlimited access to their massive film and video archive. After leaving a PhD program in politics in the early 80s, Curtis was hired by the BBC making journalistic films. In his films, he's tackled the rise of individualism and public relations in the century of the self, to the war on terror and the strange connections between neoconservatives and Islamists in The Power of Nightmares. More recently, in All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, he examined the role of Silicon Valley and neoliberalism in our current political moment. It's hard to pin down Curtis's politics exactly, but with Hypernormalization, which came out just before the 2016 US election, and now with Can't Get You Out of My Head, he brings his project up to our current crises, including COVID-19, and how everything has coalesced at this exact moment. This new 6-part, 8-hour film traces the origins of our feelings of powerlessness today, the radical movements of the 20th century, the triumph of individualism, and the loss of any new ideas. I, for one, don't think it's true to say that Curtis is simply telling us things people didn't know, but rather pointing out stories we've forgotten or ignored. Watching his films can be a real exhilarating experience, for the way that he tells his stories and the proliferating connections between seemingly disparate events provides a rush of feeling few other documentaries do. I think that's part of why he's become both a beloved and polarizing figure in film and political circles, because he gets to the emotional content behind both filmmaking and our political and social environments. So, let me start by asking Anton, beyond the political and historical content of the film, how does Can't Get You Out of My Head work for you as a film?
I would say I found the movie both supremely fascinating, but ultimately unsatisfying. And I think part of that is that it's stretched over 8 episodes, and early on you see where you think he's going to be going, and it's as you sort of said, it's a little bit thrilling, it's exciting, and when he finally gets to sort of the present, and we've been tracing the roots of all these present issues and crises, I found it a little bit unsatisfying with how not complex some of his takes on the current situation were, and it just didn't. Ultimately, it's sort of like a 6-part, 8-hour narrative. I didn't find it satisfying for its climax, for where it arrived at.
Interesting. I do wonder how much of that is due to him. In my opinion, one of the things I really liked about the film is that, to me, Can't Get You Out of My Head felt like this is like a culmination of some projects that he's been working on, going back into some of his earlier films. So there's his critiques of individualism, his this idea of stasis or the loss of the new, the technocracy, and giving ourselves over to sort of computerized, algorithmic ideas. This is something that goes back to, All Watched Over, By Machines Loving Grace, but even further going back to Century of the Self, which I think a lot of people would say is probably one of Curtis's sort of major works, if not his most major work. It was even shouted out, I think it was like 2 years ago, by Kanye West, was like, you guys got to watch this documentary. It's on YouTube. It's by this guy. He's talking about how Edward Bernays, who was Freud's nephew, was like created PR and all that. So, yeah. And it's interesting. I didn't find it I found it a little more satisfying than you. But anyway, Aren, what did you think?
So I think the word you said in the setup, exhilarating, is kind of the way I describe his filmmaking style and his storytelling. And I think in the midst of all the confusion and just genuine unpleasantness of the current moment, it's nice to watch a film that seems to tap into not only the various historical movements that have led us to this place, but the actual emotional feeling of what it's like to live in this suffocating world. And so that's why I think the title of the movie is so important, or the subtitle, I should say, An Emotional History of the Modern World. Because the emotional take is the key thing with Adam Curtis, I think. He ultimately is dealing with, he's almost trying to make a corrective to what he thinks are wrong-headed views of how reality works, whether it's political takes or whether it's cultural takes or pure pop cultural takes. He seems to be responding against that and saying that the shrinking way of viewing the world is leading to people feeling, A, B, and C. And so he offers his movies as a corrective, but he doesn't actually take a different approach in how to get there. He also uses various emotional, narrative, and kind of repetitive tools to build up a case that works counter to what he sees as the suffocating nature of fear and powerlessness that is in our culture. But his ultimate effect is wanting to be like, well, actually, all these things you're being told, they're not necessarily true. And it's very much a simplification and a black and white story that's being delivered to you. And so just on a pure emotional sense, watching a movie that takes 8 hours worth of historical tidbits about the 20th century and various radical movements and is able to come to this conclusion of being like, actually, there's this grand history of why you feel the way you do and why you're not crazy and why it's not like some kind of secret occult thing. It's actually just picking up on strands of history that people ignore and deliberately want you to not pay attention to. And this is what... It's not even so much like this is why you're feeling or you are special. It's basically like you're not alone. And I'm going to place you in the historical moment. So in a weird way, his whole recursive collage style, his jumping back and forth between various kind of incoherent, in some respects, political views, is basically just placing the viewer as the main character of the film he's telling.
I just want to point out one thing, that pick up on something you said there, Aren, which is that this is not an occult history. And it's something I gestured to in my introduction here by saying that these are not, like, he's not giving you the secret history. This is, you know, I've already read a few people who are like, Curtis is delving into conspiracy theory. And if someone who's never watched an Adam Curtis movie listens to this podcast and goes and looks at it, looks up, you might find people accusing him of conspiracy theory, but he's not, in my mind. This is not conspiracy theory. It's more like there's the emotional element here is in helping us, not in a therapeutic way, as in, then we'll be all better, but in a way helping us to process history that we've either repressed or rewritten or, not dealt with. And I think I can talk a little bit later about some of the specific ways that he gestures that in this series, but I just think that's important to point out.
It's an emotional history, right? I mean, that's the subtitle, not a secret history. And it's funny that people would label him as being a conspiracy theorist, because one of the theses of the work is that the conspiracy theories that people are obsessed with and have been obsessed with over the 20th century, or since, about the early part of the 20th century through to now, have emotional reasons that underpin them. And that's what he's really exploring. Like, why is it that people latch on to simplifying conspiracy theories to explain the complexity of life? One thing you said, Aren, was that there's sort of the exhilaration of the build-up. And one of my frustrations with the film was that I found it more repetitive and less culminating. I didn't actually see it as much. Early on in the first episodes, I saw it as a build-up in that you're getting new layers and new things added on. But by the final episodes, I felt that he was kind of just repeating the same point and exploring it in a new context, and that it wasn't so much that the themes were getting built up more and more. And so I was losing my a bit of that exhilaration by the end. But it might have also been the setting of how you view it. I watched 3 hours to finish it off, and I think part of that was that by hitting the end of just 3 hours of viewing, right? It's a episode 5 is like 1 hour, and then the final one's 2 hours. That might have not been the ideal way to also finish off.
I think you're picking up on something that sounds accurate, even if my take, like, I probably was more exhilarated and more on board with the film than you. I do think that it's completely fair to say that the film doesn't have this kind of conventional narrative build. It's weird because it's an 8-hour movie delivered in 6 parts, and I know there's this kind of waffling between, is it a TV show or is it a movie? Is it a miniseries? Like, what exactly is this? And because it's delivered through the BBC iPlayer, that clarifies nothing. Like, if anything, that the delivery just muddles the waters even more. Mm-hmm. The way I think about it is actually similar to the OJ Made in America movie from 2016, where that was cut into different parts, and the parts were, in that movie, the parts were necessary to allow you a bit of a gap to process the sheer amount of information that you're getting into your brain. And I think that's the same thing here. I don't believe it's a TV series because I don't believe each episode or part of it works as an episode as like a distinct unit. What it is that it's 6 parallel movements happening that all lead to one focal point at the end. And so it's not actually a matter of part 2 builds on part 1 and escalates it. It's merely that part 2 will like restart it and end up at the same point. And then in part 6, he picks up there and takes you to the end. That is,
this might be putting you on the spot, but have you thought about how you would like outline those structures? Like, what would be because I agreed to a point that I
Yeah.
think you're right, that like he does jump. It's not they aren't strictly chronological, right? Like the first episode isn't only about, the 19th century, and then we get, there's definitely movements in time from now back, and then he Curtis loves to do that like, oh, and then 15 years later or 90 years ago, and you get sort of those moments.
It's digressive.
Building those
storytelling.
connections over time.
Yeah. It's a hyperlink film in a lot of ways, you might say, for a guy who is in some ways, I wouldn't say skeptical or maybe more disillusioned with the possibilities of what the internet could have been and what it has sort of become. I actually think he is actually somewhat optimistic in the end, even though in my notes I have this as being one of Curtis's most melancholy and sad films, even though a lot of his films deal with stuff that, on the surface of it is extremely depressing, war on terror, the, economic collapse, all these kinds of things, right? But I also think the reason I think of it as a film as well is that it's not an info dump, just purely, right? Like there is a narrative. He's building narratives. And he's building connections, particularly between characters. I think it's important that the BBC website, one of the things that they give you along with the episodes is this list of key characters, right? And he'll go back to revisit these characters, these people as, diverse as Michael X, Afeni Shakur, Julia Grant, Edward Limonov, right? Like Bernard Kouchner, like people who you're like, what do they have in common, right? And I think so, but there's like sort of, he connects them thematically, and through their character development, we get to return to them and see what happened to them. And some of them go in very, unconventional places.
But that points out one of my, what I think maybe one of the, I don't know if I'd say flaw, but one of the aspects of the film that I dislike the most is the fact that one of his main points is that in an increasingly complex world, people retreat into fantasy or conspiracy theory or simplified narratives of what reality is.
And what humans think of as their self is actually an accessory that tries to make sense of this chaotic mass of incoming data. But to do that, it has to simplify and turn that data into stories that are sometimes so simplified that they bear little relationship to the reality outside.
And what I actually found the documentary doing is constructing a simplified narrative to explain that complexity. I actually think the film itself is guilty to a degree of what he is charging, our society is doing, in the sense that it's his reliance on anecdote, picking up on a couple individuals and trying to thread them together over time. I do feel like he's participating in this to an extent. I don't know how conscious that is, or if it's a sense of that it's inevitable, that you can't not do that. That's how we make sense of the world, getting into the psychological stuff that he's talking about in the film.
I think actually the thing is, I think it's deliberate, and I think he would probably admit that he feels that the simplifications or the stories that we are told are lies, and that there is something profoundly emotionally powerful about a simple story of the world, a concrete thing that holds up to inquiry, or to, that gives you a foundation upon which to frame your own emotional experience of something. And so he's criticizing these things, but I think he's criticizing them because the result of the various things that he's outlining, whether it's the descent of radicalism into kind of consumerist culture, whether it's the shifting of proletariat revolution into authoritarianism, whether it's simply having guys who are trying to screw with you about conspiracy theories become crazed conspiracy theorists themselves, the result of all of these simplifications is to reduce us to afraid, powerless people.
Because what it said was that in a dark world of hidden power, you couldn't expect everything to make sense. That it was pointless to try and understand the meaning of why something happened, because that would always be hidden from you.
And so he admits that the emotional effect of that is persuasive, but that the conclusion is wrong. And so his approach is to take the same tactic, but he wants to take you backwards. Basically, it's like you've driven along this road in this certain way on this train, and you've arrived at this dead-end station. I'm going to drive you back along the train and show you how actually it's not a one track, it's a multiple track. It's like he's using the methods of the confusion and the various powers in the world against them to unwrite their narrative. And so I think the key thing with this movie is the conspiracy theory thing, which he picks up on, which he shows through Kerry Thornley and his Illuminati stuff in the back pages of Playboy, and how that dovetails with Jim Garrison's investigation into JFK and the friendship with Lee Harvey Oswald and all that, and how conspiracy theories feed that spot in the brain of saying, no, you've actually onto something. He kind of does that in his filmmaking. Mm-hmm. But because he's not using occult information, because he's not using conjecture, yeah, he uses anecdotes to create emotional little vignettes here and there, but the actual historical movements, the actual footage that he's using, the actual narrative of history that he's building on is all real and it's all out there. And the structural thing that kind of shows that he's not making anything up is that he is using the archival warehouse of like the greatest imperial database in the world, the BBC, to lay all this out there. So it's not like he's breaking in and exposing things. He's like, no, this is just the detritus of empire. I'm just going to reassemble it to give you the story that they have conveniently told you is not true.
But he does use, I guess there was a couple points. Like I agree in the sense that it's not occult because, I mean, he's drawing on archive footage. So often people are speaking the words. He's not putting words into their mouths. But he does use his famous sort of narrative repetitions, right, when he's describing something. And sometimes those bridge over or ascribe something that I was wondering if that's real. Like he sometimes ascribes an emotion to the historical figures that I'm wondering whether it's provable, or there'll be moments, for instance, when he talks about how the growing opposition in the British Empire to the opium trade, and then he says something like, and it mutated into the yellow peril.
The guilt over what Britain had done to China began to mutate. It changed into fear.
And I was like, wait a second. What's your evidence for that? Like, it was one of those things where it's like I felt like I caught him in a bit of a jump in the sense of, you actually haven't proved that this one emotion mutated into another one. You've just ascribed that.
No, that's fair.
But here's the thing. I think that those are moments where they should encourage you to dig back into things. Like, one of the ideals of a Adam Curtis thing for me that has been actually in my own even like research and work has been to get me to dig in. And guess what? Like, yeah, some of the narratives are slightly simplified, right? But once you start digging into things like, when I watched All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, his 2011 film, 3-parter, and talking about the Californian ideology and its connections to Ayn Rand and, things like that. And that got me digging in. And the more I dig into that, it's like, this is actually like just all out in the open. I mean, when he didn't need to do as much work there because those things were there. And I think there's actually a lot of work based on like the way that the Yellow Peril came out of sort of imperial entanglements in the East, right? And especially also in America then later in characters like Fu Manchu and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. For me, the other thing, like even I would pick up on like there's little things that I would have liked him to push into, but I think they would have in one sense derailed what Aren's saying is the emotional trajectory of the thing, right? Like, so for instance, he interviews the one guy who's part of the German Red Army the Beidermeinhof group, right? Like one of the interesting things is that like that guy actually is like a neo-Nazi now. How did that, like there's a whole documentary on its own, is like how does a guy who was a radical left-wing terrorist go to becoming like a neo-Nazi, right? Like, yeah. So there's those kinds of things, but I think that in the overall arc, it's very interesting. But I want to get back to what I think we're uncovering is some of his formal strategies, right? In terms of like even the work with character. One might say if you're so setting up a film that is critiquing individualism, it seems strange to focus on individuals in one sense, right? But he's not necessarily saying that we're not individuals in that sense, but he wants to actually what he's doing is showing these connections. I think one of the most radical things about this entire documentary that in some ways pushes against the dominant political and social beliefs of our time on both the right and the left is the idea of China, including China as one of the great powers that's suffering a crisis right now, right? A crisis of new ideas. And saying that, no, actually China is perhaps much weaker than we believe it to be in terms of its, not necessarily its control over its citizens and things like that, but
even just economy.
Exactly. Like, and how bound up we all are with each other, right? From the economic level. I mean, he shows how China pursues like this different course of action than we do, but I think in doing that, he wants to show the like sort of interconnectedness of human beings. And you could almost imagine it as like, do you remember the films like the Koyaanisqatsi, the documentaries? The interconnectedness of life, and there's some similarities there in trying to take a big picture view of humans, and I think he does that a lot of times with like shots of people from like large distances, marching in masses, showing cities from like the air, things like that. So there's like cinematography in terms of that, but then also like just patterns start to emerge of like the editing and the choices of clips that he uses and things like that as well.
Just like latching onto a bit of that comment, which is the idea of the individual within it all. And he's kind of been open about some of his literary influences. And so maybe one of the reasons why I'm less likely to hold him to account for certain emotional papering over of things or deductions. He'll say Richard Nixon was scared here, or Zhang Qing was driven by this emotion. And if this was an act or a work of journalism purely, I would be bothered by that, because I would say that you are now taking it out of the realm of fact and you're turning it into the realm of narrative and story. But I don't think he's a journalist. He's a filmmaker. He's a documentarian. He's working in that kind of Herzogian, more ecstatic, emotional level. Not to quite the degree of Herzog, who will like fake things. Oh, note. But he's influenced by writers like Tolstoy, like John Dos Passos, trying to tell the stories of societies through key individuals who embody the emotions of those societies, which is why I think it's so important that the film brings you into it. It uses these individuals and it pleads its case to you as an individual, saying, you're like Michael X, you're like Zhang Qing, you're like Afeni Shakur. You've experienced the fears and the emotions. They've walked this path before you and made choices and come to conclusions based off things that you are now experiencing yourself about how the world works. And therefore, you have a chance that they don't to decide what the conclusion of the story is, which is where the hopefulness comes in. But that's kind of its approach to narrative in terms of character.
I think like I've probably been the most negative on the film, even though overall I am positive about it. And I think you're pointing out some of the things that I think are actually great about this film, in that it's an accomplishment, regardless of whether someone is persuaded by his ultimate ideas or arguments. He's told a highly complex and also epic in scope story, not only about the West, but he's talking about what's going on in China, in mostly in the U.S., in the U.K., and the relation to the world through empire, through other connections. So he's been able to distill some important threads. And I think the other thing he's doing, that I was just like watching this, I would commend it for how on topic it was. That everything that seems important in the moment right now, whether you're talking about what's going on with China, what's going on with conspiracy theories and QAnon, what's going on with our consumerism, what's going on with the internet and how we regulate speech and information, all these things he's taking on in one mammoth 8-hour documentary, but he's bringing it all together, and I give him a lot of credit for that, because it's ambitious in scope, and you do need these characters to make sense of it all. And it's clear. It's pretty easy to follow. It's not like a confusing movie.
That's the kind
It's
of
fun.
thing that it's easy to overstate when we dig into these complexities. It's the kind of thing that even when we were kind of approaching this episode, I was a little bit worried that if we just dig into what it gets into, it makes it seem like it's this muddled manifesto that like it's like a 500-page tome. But no, it's an 8-hour movie in 6 parts, which sounds really cumbersome, but it is ridiculously entertaining, especially if you have any interest in history, if you have a formal interest in montage, in music videos, in the juxtaposition of ironic imagery. If you just simply like hearing tidbits about things that then you can go and dive into the wiki wormhole afterwards and really dig into it. Because on a pure entertainment level, it actually works marvelously, and it works so much better than some of the didactic bullshit documentaries you get on Netflix.
And this is what I would actually want to say. I think something both of you touched on, which is that he is a storyteller, right? And I think some of the criticisms of Curtis that even he's come up against in recent years in this film, that he's maybe not, glossing over things and stuff like that. I'm like, we don't hold other filmmakers to that account who are documentarians. I mean,
Michael Moore.
like
I think
maybe it's like
when you want to be the critic of I think it's partly because he's such a strong critic of the storytellers who've created the world today, and so that they have to push back,
His films approach it in a principled manner so that if you undercut any of that, it seems like a loss of the very righteousness that is almost the perspective that you need to believe it, because it has to be without cynicism and it has to be without guile.
But I actually think it's all there on the surface in a way that's actually honest, in a way that other, like the use of irony you pointed out, Aren, in juxtaposition, he in the use of sort of funny images or playing, cool pop songs over, atrocities and things like that. Like he's all up front with it. And a lot of the documentaries, and I've watched a lot of documentaries in the last year, actually, I think we forget that documentary there's no such thing as like a neutral status, right? No. Like the camera is always somewhere. But if anything, he approaches that because of the BBC providing this kind of panoptic source material, right? So, but coming back also, Aren, like I thought this film was both vastly entertaining, but also like there's some moments in this that are like terrifying, sometimes only just because you're reminded of the world that we live in. I think of that footage of the person driving through a fire. I think it's the beginning of episode 3.
Yeah.
And it's
this
California wildfires in 2018. That's horrifying.
It's just so horrifying.
Like, oh my.
You like couldn't make this stuff up. You know what I mean? If you wanted to.
But that's kind of the thing with some of the emotional effect, though, and why I keep framing it in this idea of us as a part of the story that he's telling. Because when everything comes to a head, and it's a brief, 30-second thing where he's like, and then COVID happened. And COVID clarified everything that everybody had always been thinking beneath the surface and brought it up. And this is the kind of thing that I have a conversation, whether it's a person at work, whether it's a family member, whether it's a friend I haven't talked to in 10 years. Everybody has this same feeling, the same emotional experience of the history we're living in. And it was actually profoundly moving to watch something say that the structures that have crumbled that are out there, this story that is occurring in front of you, it's like you are not the cause of this.
Do you think that describing or thinking about how you and Anders have described the film, I think we could describe the film as also it's like a reverse engineering of the emotional, of people's emotions. It shows how the feelings we have right now, right, have been created and manufactured, and he comes at that very, just clearly, but also honestly, and really also shows how you get to that point. They're
I think there's a really interesting point, which is one of the underlying themes of the film, which is that and this is part of his critique of individualism. It's not all individualism necessarily, but it's this idea that there's something wrong with us and that we need to change our insides because our emotions come from within, right? But what if sometimes our emotions are actually impacted upon us from the outside, right? Like COVID, I had nothing to do with COVID starting, but my emotions that I'm experiencing during this pandemic, and I kind of hit a wall last week of some of this stuff. It's like pretty common. It seems like a lot of people I've talked to have had those similar emotions. So that tells me that no, those are not like within me. It's not something that if I just meditate more, I'm going to be feeling better, right? The way this film creates emotion is really through its film style. And I think that's a really important thing to mention, right? So the way the style creates a sort of sense of coherence. By layering this image and this image, you get something new. In this sense, I think that Curtis is really working in the same tradition of like montage artists like Chris Marker, or even like some of Godar's work and people like that, which may seem to some people, make it off-putting, but I think he does it in a really accessible way that isn't off-putting at all.
Yeah, just in a basic description, if you've never seen even a frame of his footage, he'll often have grainy shot of a propaganda film from the 40s from China, and then he'll cut to a ominous shot of skyscrapers in the 80s in New York, and then he cuts to a music video moment, say of Tupac, or some 1960s jingle where you have black and white footage of happy-go-lucky white people dancing, and then he'll have his kind of very dignified British narration, which I think we have to be clear that plays into it. If he was American, it would seem a little bit like he's a crackpot, but because he has this very calm, dignified BBC, British BBC accent,
we think of David Attenborough or people,
and it just slips in and it says that this man is to be trusted, which is again him using the tools of what he criticizes against those structures to critique them. Like he's using the shortcuts of storytelling to convince you of his argument.
So his interest in forging connections between things that are unlikely pairings is both the key to his narrative structuring and like intellectual structuring, and then also the emotional aspect, right? The impact it has on you. So that it's a really interesting. It's interesting the repetitions too. I found both fascinating but also sometimes troubling, or just like troubling in the sense of like bothersome. Like there was times where it's like we gained another of these strange the communist Chinese operas and like the dancers with
the
like,
Red Guard propaganda films.
the Red Guard propaganda dancing with like a rifle in a communist garb, and then or his obsession with showing like just like people dancing for long periods of time, and you're like, where is this one from? And it's like, and then he'll replay like certain images again and again, and you're wondering, I always wonder like how does he like find some of these key clips? Like there's there'll be those one images that he repeats in almost every part, and you're like, how did he find those ones? And then they sort of come to symbolize so much of what he's thinking or trying to, the case he's trying to make.
Well, because he'll slow it down, right? And like he'll linger on it, and the music will supply the emotion, so it's almost like you're boring into the soul of Zhang Qing or Afeni Shakur or Michael X, and you're seeing something in their eyes which might not be there, but because of the associations of what he's brought before, because of the montage effect through the Eisensteinian almost manipulative manner, he's building these emotional parallels between everybody.
I think it's also, like you mentioned, the music. I think it's worth talking about the music in Adam Curtis's films because he's definitely has an interest and he finds some really great tracks.
And there's a hit right there. It's a hipster aspect to him. That the fact that the main thing that makes these movies cool and not just sort of interesting documentaries is his use of music.
Mm-hmm. Like he's known for his use of like the like British like art, like Burial. It was like a electronic artist from the UK.
He loves Brian Eno.
Yep, of course Brian Eno. Brian Eno is the great like ambient artist. There's a lot of ambient music, a lot of like electronic stuff, but also just pop music as well. And he finds sometimes those really great bits. I know they mentioned this when he was on the BBC's own talk show a couple weeks ago with Mark Kermode. There's this really great cover of The Smiths called "The Light 3000" by an artist named Schneider from like 2001. That's just like, you at first when it starts out, it's like sort of like clicking electronics, and then you realize that it's like the cover of the Smiths.
Oh, yeah,
There's a Light That Never Goes Out, and you're just like, oh, this is just amazing. Or like I've mentioned a number of times to you guys at the end of episode 4. The use of this track by this band Johnny Boy that I didn't know, they only have one album and it was connected somehow to Manic Street Preachers, but and it's that we are the generation that bought more shoes and we get what we deserve. And it's just like, this song was written in 2006, and yet the lyrics and everything feel like they were like written for his documentary. It's like at one point they sing, "I just can't help believing, though believing sees me cursed." It's like, like, I don't know. So he's really, really good. He's obviously a music fan. He's into, that typical British music media culture.
Do we know how large his team is for like pouring through these archives and finding stuff? Because I'm just curious about the whole process.
He's pretty opaque with the process. I haven't been able to find anything about him actually discussing how he puts these together. It seems like it's kind of his trade secret.
Yeah. Well, it is definitely...
It takes him 5 years.
Something amazing, right? Too. Like, it's one of his strongest things is that he's found... Often he's like, he finds interviews that people have either forgotten about, don't remember, but it's there,
like
in
the young
archive,
Tupac,
been recorded.
When he was like 16, 17.
Before he's the rapper, doing a fascinating, discussion of like revolutionary politics.
And gangsterism as like failed, revolution.
Angry reaction about, against failed radical movements. And
forgetting that his mother was a radical.
And they had a lot of footage I was surprised by how much footage of the Cultural Revolution they had. Like, footage obviously shot at the time. Even some of the Tiananmen stuff he had.
Yeah.
Was impressive.
Not the usual images, right? They're not the usual.
It's not just that one image of the guy standing in front of the tank.
It's not Tank Man. It's the camps and the student protests.
Yeah.
So for you guys, we've mentioned a few times, this is an 8-hour documentary, 6 parts. And Anton, we've mentioned a few times that it's, there is repetition even as it builds to something. Maybe we can end our conversation about what it builds to and why I see it as ultimately optimistic in some ways. But is there an episode for you guys that you would recommend to someone if they didn't have time for 8 hours, that they were just going to sit down and watch one? I'll go first because I have one. I think is it episode 4 is the Lordly Ones, or episode 5? Episode 5, part 5. The Lordly Ones, I think, is really good in terms of its analysis of empire in Britain, and very specifically about that. Even though it's the one that contains, I know, Anton, what you're talking about, what you felt is the jump from the Opium Wars to the Yellow Scare and that kind of thing. But I think it does a really good job of analyzing something about as I said earlier, the failure to come to grips with the histories of our own countries, right? Like a sort of a repression or suppression of the past in some ways, and a desire to see ourselves as exceptional in some way. And it's traced through some of the earlier episodes, in episode 1 with the stuff about Kenya and things like that. But I think that one, just on its own, stands as a very interesting document that I would recommend to anyone.
So if people have never watched any of his stuff before, I would just say start at part 1 and see what you think, because he does approach this a bit as a culmination. People like me who are weirdos and have watched, not all of them, but like 6 or 7 of his very long films, recognize the way that it pulls bits of The Trap in here, and it pulls bits of Power and Nightmares, and it pulls bits of these earlier arguments, but he seems to be approaching it as if you have no context of his style. And so part 1 is very much like, I'm going to sink you into the warm water. And it's why he starts with that phrase, we're living in strange times, and in America and in the UK, people are overwhelmed by the feeling of uneasiness about how the direction the world is going. And so he's setting up something that should be undeniable for any viewer, and he's going to tell you why. you're feeling that way, and it's kind of like an automatic, or it's a very smooth emotional transition into his specific form of filmmaking and his specific form of storytelling. So yeah, I would just say start at part one, see what you think.
I would agree, Aaron, that in one sense that even though this is sort of like, his most recent film and it's about things now, in many ways it's kind of like a really good primer and intro to Adam Curtis, and if you could go back then and explore some of his other more focused films.
And that's kind of going back to something I said much earlier in this conversation, but it's why I think he breaks this film up into 6 parts. It's not because it's a TV show. It's because he doesn't want to overwhelm you, and he wants to give you the like as much as you can take, but not blow your mind with just too much information. It's the whole, like, if you watch one part an evening, you're going to get time to decompress, get interested about where it goes, and then start again the next day. So it's simply like a breather.
What I found very compelling about the first part was the way it sets up a bunch of things, and without him even saying explicitly how they're connected to specific things right now, you already start to get an inkling of like where he might be going with this. For example, in the first part, the way he talks about paranoia in the American culture, going back all the way to the Puritans leaving England, how it's always been there in the background. And then he has an example of like the John Bircher Society in the early 60s or late 50s, thinking that Eisenhower is a plant of the communists. And you're like, oh my goodness, like this conspiracy theory, this drive towards conspiracy theory has been a part of like American conservatism since its inception in the 50s, right? Or the late 40s.
Late 1700s, yeah.
Well, actually, that points to one of my big beefs with Adam Curtis is just that, like, as someone who's, right, like I'm a Renaissance scholar, he only is interested in the past 2 centuries.
The modern, but not in the
even
modern.
They're very modern.
Like 1940 to now.
And so some of his points, which I think are good points, and I think a lot of people would be like, oh, that's a really good point, but I'm like, the whole idea that, like, the fact that psychology was discovering that maybe your conscious self is having, isn't the only part of you, that you're sort of having tensions with other part of yourself. I'm like, well, yeah, so we could go back to Freud, we could go back to Luther, we could go back to St. Paul. Like, he just seems that he's not interested in the fact that these things actually aren't just ideas.
No, it's not that he's not interested. Is that he is primarily interested in how they're expressed through the visual form of television and film, which doesn't exist. So it's almost a nature of the fact that he's an archivist. Like, that is his method of filmmaking, means that he is tied in the actual historical period he can explore. So he can really only explore the past, whether it's the Opium Wars, through the propaganda films, because that allows him the footage. So it's the kind of emotional way of investigating history through the visual medium of film.
That actually solves the problem in some way, Aaron, of why Anton, he skips from the Opium War to the Yellow Peril stuff. Is because that's when all that footage was made.
I get
because he couldn't actually show.
This is his domain, right? And he's going to work in it, and we can't really ask him to know everything or talk about everything within a film, right? Like, we can't fault him for that, but he'll sometimes just make claims like a sense of Englishness that emerged in episode 5. He talks about in part 5 with the Lordly Ones. This idea of Englishness emerged in the 1920s or the 1910s, right? And I was like, well, not really. Like, the whole idea of an English gentry, this is going back to the Civil War and earlier, but I find it hard when he sort of makes these statements about, like, this is when it began.
He doesn't qualify or categorize his statements, even if he knows different. Yeah. So did you ultimately think that the film was, whether, Anton, you said it was a bit of a, sputtered out at the end for you, I thought it ultimately, to take up on Aaron's idea of posing us as the main characters, it ends up being somewhat hopeful, even though it sort of puts the work onto us. And I think that David Graeber quote, which he opens and sort of ends with, is really, really important.
The anthropologist and activist David Graeber, who died last year, described the forgotten idea that is waiting to be rediscovered, and how thrilling it could be. The ultimate hidden truth of the world, he wrote, is that it is something we make, and could just as easily make differently.
And I think that, to me, is where the hope comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
But and I think sort of the thesis of the film in many ways is that we've given up on that. We think that we're, ironically, even as we've become hyper individualistic, we see ourselves as completely helpless to think of anything different.
Yeah, I think that's the closest he comes to a political statement or manifesto out of this. His work's very nebulous, and it seems like he's deliberately, and I think correctly, attempts to dodge these simple binaries that exist in our current political spectrum. But that's, I think, the closest to something that you can take away and be inspired by, which is actually a very conventional documentary tactic where you spend 95% of it doom and gloom and then 5%, well, but there's a chance.
I guess I was a little bit less, I sensed less hope in it than you guys. To me, he sounded a little bit more sad and like, right, guys? Like, you guys can change your minds, right, guys?
I did mention it as very sad and melancholy film.
But you know why I think? It's that because it stands out in marked contrast to his previous works, which don't offer you any of that. So that's a thing where somebody who has a bit more of a context within him as a filmmaker can make that be like, oh, he's added something new. And that seems to be a statement in and of itself.
Edelweiss, Edelweiss, every morning you greet me, small and white, clean and bright, you look happy to me.
As we wrap up thinking about the new and what might emerge next, I think we want to spend a bit of time at the end of this podcast talking about Canadian acting legend Christopher Plummer, who passed away a couple weeks ago.
I basically think that Christopher Plummer, I don't even think this is like a subjective take. He's the greatest Canadian actor of the 20th century. And I don't think you could take it on film or you can take it on stage. And the fact that it's both kind of makes it inarguable.
Yeah, I mean, even, I'm recording this from Waterloo, less than half an hour away from Stratford, Ontario, where Plummer, that festival wouldn't be a thing to some degree without him.
Yeah.
So do you have specific, when Plummer died, was there specific films that you thought of that came to mind immediately? I think I don't know if I can speak for all three of us, but I think, growing up in our home, obviously The Sound of Music played a big role. I think our mother has said it's her favorite movie of all time. And, it was a film that we watched frequently as children. And so, even though I know that Plummer kind of tried to distance himself from the role.
He hated it.
He hated
when
it,
the movie
but
came out in the years sort of immediately after it, he really publicly said he loathed it and hated it. And I guess in his memoir, and by the time he sort of in his later years, he started to soften on. He didn't sort of come super warm, but he softened on his dislike. But I think a little bit of that is just the kind of actor he was, and I feel like it's almost like part of the persona where he can't like the fact that he was in this amazing children's musical.
And I think it's easy to, I rewatched Sound of Music this past week, and it's easy, I think, for people in our cynical day and age to, see it as sentimental or saccharine, or how it, papers over history and some things like that. But it actually, rewatching it works phenomenally well as a film. And it's in part to his performance. He's my kids who had never seen it before, the boys were like, at first they were put off by him and his, whistling and being very strict with the kids, but they immediately began to see how subtle his performance is and the love he has for his children. And let's be honest, he was an extremely handsome man, and he gives some like really, really great, like iconic images. I mean, I know it's popped up in GIF form over the last few years, but the image of him like tearing a Nazi flag in half is a great like moment,
There was a comment on the recent episode of Film Spotting, when they were talking about Christopher Plummer briefly and The Sound of Music, and I thought it sums up things so well about him as an actor, which is The Sound of Music is a favorite, stage play for high schoolers to do. But oh dear Lord, do I feel bad for whoever has to play Captain Von Trapp, because they'll never, ever, 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 ever live up to Christopher Plummer. There's just no chance. And so it sounds funny because it's a simpler quote unquote movie than some of the other ones he did later in some of his stage work. It's not Shakespeare. It's Rodgers and Hammerstein, and it's not necessarily the film he wanted to be defined by, but it's the first thing that came up when he died. And the fact that it's a movie that's over 60 years old, is it almost 70 years old now?
It's 1965, so.
Yeah, pretty close to 70. So the fact that it still has that kind of control over our imagination, and he's such a huge part of it. Like, obviously, Julie Andrews is, but...
And Robert Wise direction and everything.
But his romantic appeal is the reason why our mom loved Christopher Plummer throughout her entire life. Anybody who's interested in men over the age of 50 seemed to have some kind of crush on him at some point in their life, especially Canadians, because he was put out there as this great, charming thespian, which we don't have many of them, which we have more than people think, but, people might not want to latch onto William Shatner as one of them.
Heather Stratford veteran.
They're good friends.
But he was also great alongside Shatner in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, which I rewatched. Reminded how much I actually liked that episode in Star Trek. But I wanted to connect a couple things. So Sound of Music, The Undiscovered Country, Plummer plays General Chang, one of the Klingon. He's like the Klingon head general, and the movie's about the Klingons forming a peace treaty with the Federation, and then there's various machinations and assassinations.
It's about old Cold Warriors who can't let go of the Cold War.
Yeah. What I found watching so my boys love Sound of Music and they've watched it a lot, so I'd seen it recently. And then watching his role in Star Trek, I noticed some things about his acting style that I just wanted to point out that I thought were very, they're memorable, they're even maybe iconic. One, his smile. He has a very distinct smile, and when he smiles, it can be charming, and then he also will smile when he is being aggressive or angry too. And he can use his smile in both ways, both to charm, but there's a certain sort of strong and almost potency to his smile. I can even think of him on the stage getting his Oscar, and he also has this smile that's very powerful. So his General Chang is always smiling at Kirk when they meet at the dinner scene. And you see the way Christopher Plummer smiles when in Sound of Music when he's approaching one of the Nazis at the dinner party. Like, his smile is being used in an aggressive way. And he also, the way he looks daggers with his eyes at Maria when he's like disapproves of her. So he was very good. You could tell, you can tell he has the background in stage because he's able to use in a very controlled way certain features such as his smile, the way he holds his eyes to convey so much emotion and information to the audience. And then the other thing, also coming from his background on stage, but I would say especially as a Shakespearean actor, is the way he modulates the speed of his speaking in a very controlled way that reminds you of, say, like Laurence of Olivier, where they go faster or they go slower, and that conveys so much, and they do it very precisely. And this goes back to, I didn't have a chance to rewatch all 3 hours, but Plummer did a TV version of Hamlet from 1964 called Hamlet at Elsinore.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them.
And I watched the first 20 minutes or so of it, and I have to go out and watch the rest of it because it's really good. And it was the first time that Hamlet was shot in Denmark at Elsinore. So it's shot on location. The production values are actually very high. And the cast is great because there's also Michael Caine is Horatio, and Robert Shaw plays Claudius. And the scene where Horatio and Hamlet meet was also a great scene to just convey this sort of his modulating, because he's like, Hamlet's going between his like very slow, and he's like, and then he like gets fast, and I just thought it was a great, and that connects to the other thing. Last thing I'll just say is that in Undiscovered Country, I've always loved how his Klingon was obsessed with Shakespeare and is quoting lines from Shakespeare throughout the movie while he's terrorizing Kirk.
Tickle us, do we not laugh? Prick us, do we not bleed? Wrong us, shall we not revenge?
And it's just brilliant. And no one else, right, like could have done that role. It's the fact that Plummer is the villain.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Hamlet at Elsinore that Michael Caine plays Horatio, because he also, Plummer was in John Huston's Man Who Would Be King with Michael Caine and Sean Connery, who also just passed away this last fall. So it's like we've lost Plummer, we've lost Connery, and yeah, but it was nice. Caine is like, up there with these friends, these guys, that generation of actors who could, do all that. Well, Caine obviously not known for his Shakespeare, but Plummer, in just that small role, he plays Rudyard Kipling. He's like in the frame narrative, but meets the characters in the film, and that's always was a memorable one for me. In the last
Plummer did a lot
decades.
of those. He did a lot of those sort of in the 60s and 70s. This sort of like British imperial adventures that they had, and Michael Caine's in a lot of them too. But
yeah,
Plummer shows up in a lot of those.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you said about his smile and the dual purpose that he was able to kind of weaponize it on screen, or use it as a charm, or use it as a threat. And that's the older he got, and the wrinklier he got, and no, it's just a fact is that the more his kind of eyes shrunk down, and the wrinkles got larger, and the folds in the skin whenever he would smile. It seems like that's all his face became, right, in later moments. And I happened to watch like Growth of Dragon Tattoo a week before he died, because I was just rewatching it. I felt in the mood because I was reading the latest book, and his performance in there, he's not like a main character, but he's an important part, and there's something about the fact that you have him as Vonger, like the patriarch of this dark and mysterious family, and just the fact that you casted Christopher Plummer seems to convey all you need to about the fact that this is a powerful man. Mm-hmm. And this is a man that if he can be a great ally, or he can be an awful, awful enemy.
You will be investigating thieves, misers, bullies, the most detestable collection of people that you will ever meet. My family.
And in the movie, he happens to, side with Daniel Craig's Mikhail Blomkvist, but it's on the flip side of that, it's a very similar performance to All the Money in the World, where he replaced Kevin Spacey and he played John Paul Getty, and he's just pure avarice, menace, and he's essentially a character playing a like figurehead of money in that film. He's almost not a character,
like a personification.
Yet, he's a personification, but because it's Christopher Plummer, and even though he filmed the role in like 1 week because Ridley Scott was trying to replace Kevin Spacey like really quickly right before the release, Christopher Plummer is just mopping the floor with every other actor in that movie, and it's another one of those things of being like, he's so good and he's so dignified on screen that he almost shames some actors. And like, I like Mark Wahlberg in some roles. I like Michelle Williams a fair bit, but they're just different classes of actor.
It's interesting that you mentioned so Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and All the Money in the World, and I think one of the other big roles in the last few years that a lot of people would remember him for will be Knives Out as the dad, right? Which is a very similar role on the surface to those the patriarch, this person that holds this whole family together, and when he's gone, things fall apart. But obviously, he plays it in a very different way, but he still has that strength and sort of control of the family, even though he's not as sinister.
He was he was great in these, probably in the last 3 decades. He was mostly playing not the lead, but either sort of villain or important supporting roles. But he always just nails it in those roles, and so much of the films really hang on him. And I even mentioned it right in that Christmas movie I reviewed and talked about in our first podcast, The Man Who Invented Christmas, that we got to see him in the role of Scrooge, and he's one of the most memorable parts of that movie. So he was great in these more character roles.
I think performers like him, like Olivier, like Patrick Stewart, we kind of undervalue because they are such consummate professionals. They never gave less than their all, or the absolutely appropriate amount of professionalism to the role that they're playing. And so I think there's usually, it's almost bad for these guys in terms of a career, because it means that you expect the best from them always, and the best becomes ordinary, and therefore they're not getting rewarded because they're rarely surprising, which is why I think a role like Beginners, Mike Mills' film, the one he finally won an Oscar for, where he's Ewan McGregor's dad who comes out late in life after his wife dies and finally gets to live openly as a gay man and kind of explore this playful side of himself that he's kept secret for the sake of the dignity of his wife. And I understand why he won the Oscar for that, because it is such an uncharacteristic Christopher Plummer role. He has a puckishness to him even when he was older, but he rarely allowed to play that in the roles that he was given. And so there's a film that actually, it's like Christopher Plummer seems happy on screen a lot, but he doesn't. You're wary of his happiness sometimes because of that nature of his smile, and because of the twinkle in his eye that could mean a threat. But in this film, it's like it allows him to let his guard down in a way in the performance, but it's actually just, in actuality, it just shows the range that he was capable of as an actor, because it's not like we're getting an authentic Plummer in that role and we're not getting that in The Insider or Sound of Music or any of those. It's just that he's so convincing in all these different modes that it's almost too bad that people didn't allow him to show the full expression of just how good he was always.
Mm-hmm.
And that puckishness comes out in his famous Oscar acceptance speech. And he has that line about where have you been all my life to the statue.
You're only 2 years older than me, darling. Where have you been all my life?
Yeah, and then also a bit of a self-deprecating comment about his wife, himself and his wife holding them together, kind of, because he did have a bit of an infamous reputation as a bit of a womanizer and a.
Yeah, and I think problems with alcohol early on.
Many great performers, but.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. When you start digging back into it, so many little great roles. Even in the voice in the Pixar Up, right? As Muntz, the villain. That's for my boys. That was the one that I was trying to say who he was, and they were like, "Oh yeah."
And I was also thinking of him as the grandfather in National Treasure, where he actually he gets to be a genuinely just nice grandpa. Supportive in a way that Jon Voight's father is not immediately so, but no, it's funny that just we're talking about these roles and just reminiscing, and it does seem like, even though I probably wouldn't say Christopher Plummer is my favorite actor or anything, but he's had such a important role in various films that I care about, and there's an affection for the performer, and I think also because we're Canadians, we feel like he was a national treasure.
Yeah,
so
I feel like he's one of the actors who I probably just sort of grew up knowing his name and liking him and feeling like he was an important actor since as long as I can remember.
And remember, we're Canadians. We always feel inferior to the States. So it was so very, and Britain too. And so it was nice to have this actor who was unequivocally the equal of all of his, fellow performers on the world, whether stage or screen.
So what we need is the Adam Curtis documentary about the emotions of Canadians.
I was actually thinking about this
And
in
they
joke
felt
texts.
inferior.
I was thinking about doing a 10-minute joke documentary through the style of Adam Curtis, but about the Toronto Raptors championship run in 2019 because it expresses all the inferiority complexes of Canada and the idea that the Raptors were this cursed team, and then something strange happened.
And
then,
Kawhi left. And they couldn't understand why he would leave at the top.
I just feel like there is Adam Curtis is a subgenre and a formula in and of itself that you can now plug in a means of understanding other things. So,
well,
definitely.
Maybe on a last note, I'll just say that the fact that he could, we can meme joke with him, but he's kind of doing meme history in the sense of he's finding patterns that recur throughout history.
And using the visual images of the last 120 years to do so. Join us again next month for a Three Brothers podcast, but stay tuned later this month. Just a reminder that it was 10 years ago in February of 2011 that we first launched Three Brothers Film, our website. And we've got some, content, and to use that fraught term that Martin Scorsese mentioned in his recent Harper's piece for you. So check the website, watch the podcast. We got something cooking up for you there, but we'll also be back for a regular monthly episode in March.
We'll probably I'm this is an on-air production meeting a bit, but I'm assuming we're going to be talking about Zack Snyder's
the
Justice
Snyder
League.
Cut.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I would also say we have these smaller, right? We usually discuss something in a shorter time frame at the end. If there are things that you want us to look at in a future podcast, do leave in the comments. We will consider it.
Yeah. So that just once again a reminder that like, subscribe, review, rate. Let us know if you're enjoying this, and stay tuned for more Three Brothers Film. So thanks for joining us, and we'll be coming at you next month.
Goodbye, Mr. Bond.
I bid you farewell.
Be cheerful, sir. Our revels now are ended. These, our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherits shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep.